Lecture 2, The Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, Common Measure and Justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens is an account in the third person. The speaker does not say, I or you. The speaker says, the king and Sir Patrick. And this is a form of storytelling from a point of view outside history, as the muse is outside of history. A point of view, however, which is inside the community. The speaker does say, our Scots nobles. In that sense, the speaker utters language from the outside of the structure of power in the human world, but internal to the collectivity of persons who suffer the effects of power and nonetheless authorize its legitimacy. The general class of poems to which this poem belongs, the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, is the praise poem. And I want you to put a marker on that classification of poem types. The praise poem. The poem which from the time of Homer, the Iliad is the praise poem of Achilles, is constructed in the West to conserve the memory of persons across the differences between persons and against the obliterating, wearing, and rusting and washing away of time. Horace, the Roman poet, says, many heroes, he says, lived before Agamemnon, but they are lost in unending night. Why? Because they lacked a bard. Such a praise poem. They're also called apodictic poems. A-P-O-D-E-I-C-T-I-C. The poem which conserves the image of the person against time and the obliviating forces of human discontinuity in history. Such praise poems, or apodictic poems, constitute judgments with respect to human value. And the character of such judgments, the judgment which conserves this story and not that, this name and not that name, such judgments is a tracing of the kind of knowledge poetry contributes to the human world. The ship of Sir Patrick Spens, like the vessel of any conscious mind as it knows itself in a secular world, went down into the sea without survivors in the interest of the conservation of human value in the form of the story of an action and against the failure of all other mechanisms of communication. The poem absurdly, impossibly tells the story of the ship, itself the principle of other experience and therefore of civilization in the ancient world, that always, like every individual mind, goes down, I'm sorry to tell you, with all hands. The voice in the ballad tells the story, against all possibility, per impossibile, of the ship that went down with all hands. And it is subject to the constraints of its own nature. Unlike the high cultural written poem, the ballad exists, as does this one, in no particular word-specific form, and I want you to consider that. The Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens exists in 20 versions, in principle in an indefinitely large number of versions. It's a ballad of tradition. The modern lyric, by contrast, is first of all the praise poem of the author of whose name it is the principle of visibility, and only subsequently the principle of visibility of the other subject. The ballad is, by its nature, capable of actualization in the words of any singer. And therefore, the ballad is not the song of its writer. You understand? Does not refer to the greatness of Grossman or the greatness of Yeats, right? Or the greatness to any one of you. The ballad has a generosity as a consequence of the absence of its investment in the specificity of the words in which it is framed. The ballad is for that reason, capable of actualization in the words of any singer, of whom it is the song, as it is freely given to the other. In that sense, too, it is a manifestation of the principle of poetry itself, which is consumed by or represented in no specific poem. In the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, this particular text we're using is conserved and in written form by a highly sophisticated editor. The voice is prior to power. The voice that sings the ballad is prior to power, comes before it, and posterior to power will come after it, and therefore it is the judge of power. And I shall show you how that is. As a collective voice, it realizes the interest, the stake in the world of a people, but at the same time accomplishes a quality of speech which articulates the speech of many in the unmistakable tones of a single mind. In that sense, strictly understood, the voice of this ballad supplies the human form and the human authority of the abstract and the transhistorical class of persons. A class is a collectivity aggregated by reason of having the same stake in the human world, whom we call the folk, and by being so constituted, this poem becomes precisely the voice of the poet in its most completely realized form, insofar as the voice of the poet in its most completely realized form accomplishes reconciliation of the collective and individual, the abstract and the particular. Such a poem as the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens seems to me to put to shame the lyric of the individual which claims the power of representation for the author herself or himself. The story that the speaker who has no name, being prior to or posterior to name, as the poem is both before and after history, the story that that speaker tells is about the death of a man who has a name, Sir Patrick Spens, and whose claim upon representation is, as I have said, the just consequence of a single act which makes him worthy of memory. The ballad gives an account, as does the epic, as in some measure does the lyric as well, of a single action worthy of memory. And the nature of poetic knowledge can be discovered, must be discovered, by the exploration of some answer to the question, what is the action worthy of memory that gives rise to the poem? I want to step back for a moment and say the following. In Western representation, there is a class of persons who have a name, are capable of action, and know the present and the at hand. Such are the principal persons, for example, in Greek tragedy. But there is another class of persons in Western representation who have no name, possess knowledge of the past and future, but are incapable of action. They are like the chorus in Greek tragedy, or the dead in Homer, or in Dante. Now, the speaker of this poem, A Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, is of the latter sort. Those unnamed persons who know the past and the future, but have in themselves no action. And I wish to suggest that the general character of our poetry, of aesthetic construction in general as we understand it, insofar as its relation to action is problematic, derives from speakers of this sort who speak from the great memory and in the alienation of the outside. In the ballad before us, the great memory of collective life speaks the speech of a person because its speaker, the person who speaks, who says, "The king sits in Dunfermline town," is a member of the social class which in a feudal society contributes to its members the characteristic of poetry just so as it comes to be defined. Now, the single act of Sir Patrick Spens, worthy of memory, derives its claim upon memory from the fact that it is, note, the act of a man who can act, who has a name, Sir Patrick Spens, but who is possessed also of that knowledge of the past and future characteristic of those who cannot act. Sir Patrick Penn becomes, like Achilles, the subject of representation because he possesses two kinds of knowledge and not one, because he differentiates himself from the two classes of his representational world and confronts, as it were, both the crisis of power and the crisis of knowledge in the act of the same will. That's his honor, his claim upon poetry as a principle of visibility, and the complex nature of his praxis or value-productive act that the poetic knowledge of the folk intends to lay before us as a truth. In fact, the author of this poem, who sings the fate of a man who has a name, the nameless author who sings of Sir Patrick Spens, the man who has a name, the author of this poem who sings of the man who has a name is, as I have said, nameless. Dunfermline town was the seat of certain Scottish kings or clan chieftains down through the 14th century, and its port was Aberdour on the Firth of Forth, open to the North Sea and giving access to Norway, whither Sir Patrick Spens is sent by the king to recover, as we know from other versions of the poem, the king's daughter or the king's bride. The ship sinks in a storm on the return voyage half over to Aberdour. Half over to Aberdour. The ship sinks in a storm on the return journey half over to Aberdour from Norway. The voice that speaks the words of the poem gives no account of how it comes to know the events of which it tells. There is no explicit apostrophe or address to source, as in London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. The voice of the speaker seems itself weighty with a knowledge of which it is itself, this ballad voice, being collective, the voice of a class, and therefore omnipresent in history, the source. Nothing is known for sure about the events of which this poem is an account, except insofar as the 20 or more versions of this poem, collected and recorded since the middle of the 18th century, make it known. The poem appears as an actualization of a memory more tenacious of existence than the world of which it maintains an account. The world has disappeared, and the poem remains our common possession. As I have said, such apodictic or praise representations are authorized by the action of another who does not sing, but is capable of an act worthy of memory, authorized by an action and thus intended to reproduce that action in history by means of the authority of representation, which is to say, the function of the poem is to specify an action worthy of praise and to assure the reproduction of that action by representing it in such a way as it becomes memorable. Here is the poem. Please follow the poem with the text so we both know it very well. The king sits in Dunfermline town, drinking the blood-red wine. Oh, where will I get a good sailor to sail the ship of mine? Up in Spark at Eldred Nicht, sat at the king's richt, nay, Sir Patrick Spens is the best sailor that sails upon the sea. The king has written a bride letter and signed it with his hand and sent it to Sir Patrick Spens, was walking on the sand. The first line that Sir Patrick read aloud, Loch, Lochhead, hey. The next line that Sir Patrick read, the tear blinded his ee. Oh, why's done this deed, this ill deed done to me, to send me out this time of the year, to sail upon the sea? Make haste, my merry men all, a good ship sails the morn. Oh, say no say, me master dear, for I fear a deadly storm. Late yestreen, I saw the new moon with the old moon in her arm, and I fear, me master dear, that we will come to harm. Oh, our Scots nobles were recht loath to wait their cock-heeled shoon, but long or all the play were played, their hats they swam a bone. Oh, long, long may their ladies sit with their fans into their hands, or ere they see Sir Patrick Spens come sailing to the land. Oh, long, long may the ladies stand with their gold combs in their hair, waiting for their own dear lords. They'll see them no mair. Half o'er to Aberdour, it's 50 fathoms deep, and there lies God Sir Patrick Spens, with the Scots Lord at his feet. Now what we've just heard is the voice, not my own, conformed to the ballad measure. What is the ballad measure? Well, the ballad measure always knows something which the high cultural forms cannot or will not say. The high cultural forms, Shakespeare's flag verse line, the way aristocrats talk to one another, is contradicted by the ballad measure. What is the ballad measure? Note, the king, 2, right? The king, 2, sits in 4, Dumfair, 6, Lean Toon, 8, or whatever. Drinking, 2, the blood, 4, red wine, 6. The ballad measure is always some ratio of 6 and 8. Got it? When it is written long, it is 14. Or when it is concretely, the ballad measure always structures and conveys knowledge, or when it is imitated by the high culture intends to do so, of what the empowered high culture does not know. Ballad measure is the characteristic meter of hymn, of the nursery rhyme. In Emily Dickinson, 1770 times, the voice of the woman is realized in the ballad measure. It is an oppositional, contracting form which states the world in 8 and then limits it in the following line of 6 according to the constraints of a wisdom which displays the laws of the world it narrates. The king sits in Dumfairling Toon, 8, drinking the blood red wine, 6. In that sense, ballad measure is a tragic meter. It is not the meter, in the first instance, of a culture that writes. The ballad announces its reality in a present tense of the verb. The king sits in, present tense, Dumfairling Town. A present tense which admits of no limit of time and no alternative states of affairs. It is the present tense of the tragic enablement and the tragic ignorance. The king sits in Dumfairling Town. The king has no name. There are 2 kinds of anonymity in play in this poem. Anonymity means namelessness, right? There are 2 kinds of anonymity in play in this poem. There is power without knowledge, the king's. And there is the anonymity of the folk which is knowledge without power. Both are nameless conditions. The king sits in Dunfermline town. The king has no name. It is the anonymity of power without knowledge. He is the principle of a social order with a single center, in this case feudal, constituted by a single empowered will, the only name of which is king. Like the written text, the king's language is without alternative, and you will note the king's command is issued by a written text, right? The broad letter. So there's an association between states of affairs without alternative, the structure of a feudal order, and writing. And in this poem, the king enacts writing, sends his lethal and uncontradicted command to Sir Patrick Spens in the braid letter. The king is the principle of a social order with a single center. Like the written text, the king's language is without alternative. This text, the poem before us, which is by its nature oral, takes the written text inside it and judges it. The crisis of the king's nature, constituting the insoluble problem which is the occasion of the failure of structuring systems that drives this poem into utterance, is the will of the king, that will which can be only one, to take on relationship, in effect to send a ship to another nation to bring home a child or a bride. That's what the king wants. That's what the braid letter commands Sir Patrick Spens to do, to take ship, to bring home a child or a bride. The contradiction which the poem mediates is situated upon the realization that the will to order can only be one. If it takes on relationship, it becomes other than itself, and the center or power of order is lost. Thus the king's directive, again, like the written text, intends both to put the other, master of a text of another kind, Sir Patrick, in service of its will, at the same time to conserve the continuity of its power by destroying the other, Sir Patrick Spens. The king sets his sailor the task of recovering the bride or the daughter at a time of year when such recovery is impossible. Do you understand? The king acts as a center which both desires and acknowledges the impossibility of relationship. This center of power, which can only be one, is thematized, is a subject which we'll return to, for example, in the great emblem of the phoenix.
This is the end of Side A. Please fast forward the cassette and turn it over to continue.